Our next guest, and I'm going to go ahead and bring him on, is Dave. And Dave, is it Ceddia? Am I getting your last name right?
It's Ceddia.
Ceddia. Oh, I should have. Well, Dave, why don't you tell us who you are, what you do, all that type of stuff?
Yeah, sure. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me on, guys. So I'm Dave Ceddia. I've been a developer professionally for probably 13 years or so. Started off kind of doing like totally not web stuff, like doing everything from, C with custom hardware, up to then like Java and jQuery, and then some Rails, and then Angular 1, and then React. So still doing the React stuff, and also kind of getting into Swift development and Mac OS stuff. So kind of a broad range of things. But mainly, I have a blog and some courses and stuff around React.
Yes, I feel like I've seen your name on lots of stuff because you just did a post that I enjoyed quite a bit on like form handling and state management, which we're going to talk to about today. So when did you get into writing? Like what got you into sort of the teaching sort of side of things?
Yeah, I think it was like 2015, so 6 years ago now or something. I started writing about Angular 1 when I was using it at work, and kind of as a way to like learn it better and kind of give back to the community and stuff. And after about a year or so of that, like Angular 2 was kind of on the horizon, and I was not a crazy fan of where that was going, so I switched gears into React. It's been React since about then.
Cool. And so I know we want to talk about state management today. So I'm curious what got you into that specifically, because it's quite the topic, right? To tackle.
Yeah, it kind of is the topic, isn't it? Like, of all the React stuff, I don't know. It feels like it's the like one of the most contentious things. I think someone in the chat earlier said like, "Are you saying there's no like one silver bullet for state management?" And
Yeah.
I think they were kidding, because there's totally not a silver bullet for state management. So there's just a ton of different options and a ton of different opinions on how to do it and how best to structure things. And really, it comes down to like, it's like an architecture problem, right? Like there's no perfect architecture. There's just trade-offs all the way down. So you pick your trade-offs, try a few of them, and pick your favorite. So yeah, I don't know. I don't really know how I got into it. I guess I just saw it as a problem that kept coming up, and I was like, I should write a post about this because it feels like there's just a ton of options, and kind of wanted to give people like a survey of what's out there.
So with state management, how do you want to tackle it? Do you want to dive just straight in? I feel like there's plenty to potentially cover here.
Yeah, I guess so. I probably have more to cover than we have time, so I'll just like try to whip through a bunch of things and see where we get.
Yeah, let's go ahead and do it. That sounds
Cool.
good. Yeah, I expect to have the comprehensive answer to state management by the end of this.
Yeah. Sorry, there's no comprehensive answer. I'm just going to give you more questions, I think.
All right, your screen's up, so you should be good to go.
All right, see how this goes. So yeah, like I mentioned, I kind of want to do like a guided tour of a bunch of different options for state management. And I've already gone over this. I do some things. State management, yeah. So contentious topic in the React world because there's so many different options. We're going to talk about kind of like real quick, like the React options for this, the built-in stuff like useState, useReducer, and the context API, and then some third-party libraries like Redux and MobX and XState and React Query. Those last two, I think, they're not like typical state management libraries, but I'm lumping them in here because they solve sort of specific classes of state management problems. Like React Query solves data fetching really well, and just like network requests in general. And XState is a state machines library, and state machines are like really good for difficult, tricky, like asynchronous problems where you've got a lot of different stuff, like a lot of moving parts to keep track of. So hopefully we'll get through all these things. So first of all, like what is state? I think this word kind of has sort of two meanings. There's like the state of the app and the data you store that represents it. So I think of like the state of the app as like, just kind of colloquially, like what state is the app in, right? So you could have like a form where it's empty, or it has text, or it has text and an error. And then you've got the data that represents that, which might be some JavaScript object with like an account name and an error or whatever. And there's also kind of stuff behind the scenes, like Ryan was talking about with Remix, like there's scroll position, there's history, things that you may not be managing explicitly in your app, or maybe you've got React Router and it's handling some of that stuff. But there's a lot of different pieces of state, and some of it you control, some of it you don't. But all of that together is kind of like the state of the app. But for state management, what we're really talking about is that data that you do control, and it's about like how and where you store it in your app, like which files and which components, and how you pass it around, how you end up changing the data, and how components are made aware of the changes. So I mentioned we'll start off with just like the built-in React stuff. So useState, if you've used React like at all with hooks, you probably are familiar with useState. This is like local component state. You call the setter, pass props around if you want to get the data somewhere else. So here's a super simple little to-do list example. We can type in some values and they get added to the list, and we can toggle them. So we have a single component here we're calling useState. We pass in our initial state, which is an empty array that ends up holding these things. And we've got these two functions, add to do and toggle to do, that flip it. Add things and toggle them. And so we've got the markup down here. We're just using a plain old form with the submit handler to deal with adding things. And these checkboxes toggle them. So the interesting part in terms of the state stuff is really these two functions here, where we've got to we have to be careful about how we update, like how we set the state. So we can't mutate this existing to-dos object. We've got to return a new one that is a copy of the old one plus this new object. Or when we're toggling, we're mapping over stuff and we're like modifying one of them but leaving the rest of them alone. So this immutable state update thing is kind of a common pattern in React, and React cares about this because if you don't do this, if you just like modify the array, then as far as React is concerned, the array hasn't changed. And when you set it, like React will re-render and be like, nothing's different. So so you'll get these weird bugs where like it appears like nothing is changing. So you've got to be careful about this. And this is just kind of a pain. Like with one level, it's not that bad, but if you've got nested levels of objects and stuff, this gets really hairy really quickly. And so this is one of the reasons why like there's so many alternatives to this state management problem that kind of try to work around this problem. And we'll see a couple of those. Let me swap back over to here. All right. So yeah, we've talked about useState. Let's look at useReducer real quick. I'm going to check out a different example. So here, it's the same component, but I'm just using useReducer instead of useState. And so this is like kind of one level up in the state management complexity. If your state looks more like an object, you've got like multiple ways you want to be able to change it. useReducer is a good way to go because you can create this reducer that handles different kinds of actions and responds appropriately. The other nice thing about this is that because the reducer is a standalone function, it receives the things it needs as arguments. So you can kind of you can take this, cut it out of here, put it in a different file, reuse it between components. useReducer is nice for that. But we still have this stuff all looks familiar, right? Like this is the same code that we had in useState, and you've got to do this careful immutable update thing, and that's kind of a pain. But still a decent option. Instead of calling the setter, we have a dispatch function where we dispatch actions, and they can be basically anything, but usually they're an object that has the type and some data. So that's what we're doing here. And everything else is pretty much the same. Cool. Let's check out user context API. I guess also use context. So Michael touched on this earlier, so I'll go through this pretty fast. Michael was talking about how to work around some of the limitations and performance problems, which is great because I'm not going to have time to cover that stuff. So let me pull that. So I've got the same component here. We're still using useReducer. And there's still a reducer, but now I have this context object. And if I pull open to do context, this is like the most bare bones way of doing this. We have a context created that's being exported. And so this is an object that's got these two pieces, provider and consumer. So on the provider side, we're going to be able to pass this data, pass whatever we want, really, throughout the app. So here we're passing an object with these three properties. And then on the consuming side, if you're using class components, or if you feel like using the consumer, you can do that too. But usually use context is a really nice way to use this. So we just pass the whole context into it, into use context, and we get back that object, the exact same one that we passed in the provider side. So a lot of people think context is like a state manager or something. It's really just like a conduit. Like it's like a pipe. You put stuff in one side and it comes out all of the components below it, no matter how many nested levels there are. So it absolves you of the prop drilling, prop threading problem where you're trying to like pass things from component to component. Sort of does that all behind the scenes, but it doesn't like hold state. I mean, it's like you're passing in a value and it's passing that down, but that's kind of where its responsibility ends. So it's like whatever you pass in there is up to you. Here we've got some data and some functions. So like Michael was saying, the gotcha here is that if we're passing in a brand new object literal every time that this app component re-renders, the context is going to see that as a new value every time, even if the stuff inside is unchanged. So it'll cause more renders than it needs, really, or it could, you know. And so, you know, for a small app like this, it's not going to matter. But as your app grows, if you have lots of extra re-renders that you didn't want to have happening, you've got to go and track down your contexts and making sure you're, you know, memoizing the values or wrapping them in use callback or something. So that's kind of the gotcha there. And this is why libraries like Redux and MobX and stuff are kind of like built on top of this, at least conceptually these days, to sort of hide away some of this complexity of being able to, or making sure you're memoizing everything correctly and stuff.
Yep, and I like the way you're approaching this, because really to this point, we've been talking about the stuff that's built into React, right? So the stuff that like you install React, you've got it and you've used it. And I think for a lot of apps, like honestly, like you could probably get what you need done using the built-in APIs. Like, so at the very least, I think, curious what you think, but usually I tell people just to start with the stuff that's built in until you have a reason, like you run into some problem that this isn't doing it for me, or this is leading to too much boilerplate or whatever, before I start looking elsewhere.
Yeah, exactly. I recommend the same. Usually, like, unless you know for sure that the thing is going to grow to the point where you need some other library. Even when I do know that, like sometimes I like to start with the basic stuff just because it feels easier to get going. There's less stuff to set up. Just, you know, just use the state until plain old use state or whatever until it gets painful. And then you're like, okay, fine, I'll add another library now. It's not that hard if you switch it early on, you know.
All problems can be solved with adding a library. That's the problem of too many libraries.
Yeah, exactly. So that's pretty much it for context. Move on to Redux, because this is kind of the next level up. We're kind of going up the tree here, up the complexity levels or something. Let me check out the Redux one. So this is sort of the biggest change we've seen so far. So we still have this app component and it's got to-dos, but all of the logic now is inside the Redux, actually Redux slice. So we've got this configure store function. We passed in an object with a reducer. To-dos reducer is coming out of this file here. We'll look at in a second. And then we pass that through the app with a provider. So it's kind of the same idea as context. I think originally Redux did use context, and these days they've got their own thing behind the scenes, but it's conceptually the same idea. You have a provider, and then everything under there can get at the store through a couple utility functions that we'll look at. So we'll look at this slice first, which is kind of where the interesting stuff happens. And this is using Redux Toolkit. So if you're used to like old Redux, if you haven't seen Toolkit, this definitely worth checking out. And Mark Erickson's doing a talk later today, I think, will be like all about this. So I won't go, won't steal his thunder here. But so we're creating a slice, which is kind of a nice encapsulation of the typical parts you need for Redux, which is a reducer and actions. You've got one reducer per action, basically. And also, like this comment says, Redux Toolkit gives you this library called immer behind the scenes, which is automatically lets you mutate things, and it will like track the mutations for you and then do immutable updates behind the scenes. So you don't have to write those like nested terrible objects anymore. You just like mutate stuff as usual. So we can just like push onto state. We can set the to-dos, whatever. And immer will just like make it happen. So this is like way better than like old school Redux. Definitely worth checking out. So anyway, so once this is kind of this is the data side of things. And then on the component side, we've got to-dos. We've got these two functions here. So use selector lets you take the whole state and grab out the thing you need. So we're grabbing the to-dos. And then dispatch lets you get a function to dispatch actions. And then we're just calling dispatch. We've got these action creators instead of having to write the objects ourselves. These functions come kind of pre-made for us from Redux Toolkit. And that's it. Use dispatch, they feed through the reducer. Kind of the same idea as useReducer, except in more files, I guess.
Yeah, so if like to summarize, I'm curious, like what do you think are the features of Redux that are like, these are the things that would be tricky to implement on your own, like just using the built-in React stuff?
Yeah, so then the nice thing it gives you is that the optimized context effectively.
Yeah.
So where context, you'd have to like optimize all the stuff you're passing into it or split stuff into multiple contexts and whatever. Redux will be smart about not re-rendering components when they don't need to. It just kind of does that out of the box.
Gotcha.
And there's lots more, you can also deal with asynchronous actions and like there's more to it. Like context is just that conduit, like I was mentioning, and Redux is like a whole thing on top of it.
Yep.
Cool. What are we doing on time? MobX?
Got about 20 minutes, so we're doing all right.
All right, doing all right. Okay, now let's look at MobX next. So this is kind of, I think, probably the second most popular state management library outside of, I think Redux is probably most popular. And then MobX is like, it's kind of a distant second, but I think it's probably second. And there's like a ton of other ones like Zustand and stuff that are newer and similar. But I don't think they have, they're not used as widely.
Yeah, it's a little early for those, isn't it? But they're starting to show up in even the chat here.
Yeah, we have someone in chat that really wants your thoughts on Zustand and Jotai.
Yeah, I haven't played with them much, so I can't give a whole lot of thoughts. Let's look at MobX because I think they're pretty similar conceptually. Where like they're, well, let's talk about this first. I think this will give us some context.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough.
Yeah.
So MobX is so where Redux is very like mechanical, like it's very explicit. Everything has an action. There's a reducer. There's this whole kind of cycle to it. But it's very traceable, right? Like you kind of know where actions are coming from and where the reducers are and everything. And changes only happen in certain places. So MobX kind of takes the alternate approach, which is it uses observables to let you just like change stuff whenever you want. It detects the changes and re-renders the components. So it makes things a lot easier. Kind of at the trade-off is that like it might be harder to track down what's happening where. But it's pretty nice. So we've got this to-do list object. I'll pull this up. So this is a class. You don't have to use a class, but it's pretty common, I think, to use classes with MobX. So it's got this make auto observable call, which is turning this into a observable, makes the instances observable. It's got a couple functions on it. They're like effectively actions. So you can add to-dos and whatever. And notice we're still mutating. We're mutating variables here, right? So we have a to-dos array. We just like push stuff onto it, modify the to-do that's passed in, and MobX will take care of it. So Immer, that library that Redux Toolkit used, is actually built by the guy who made MobX.
Yeah, it's interesting because this is actually the first time I have not seen MobX code before, and it's interesting to me how like this is almost like a different paradigm for how you're handling it completely. Whereas like all the other examples where like you're like, oh, this part looks familiar and this is a small change. This is like quite a bit different. So I could see this being like a like it or hate it situation, because I think some people like this programming paradigm would like really, you'd enjoy it, and some people would probably just go like, like throw this out. It's because it really is quite a bit different.
Yeah, it's very different. So like it kind of goes against the functional immutable style that like React is known for, I think, and a lot of the libraries kind of go along with that. And MobX is like, we'll make everything observable. You just change it whenever you want.
Well, that's why like I was actually getting like Angular vibes from this code, because Angular is like, I mean, some people in chat might hate me for this, but Angular is like a little bit less functional, right? It's a little more like classy. This syntax is more reminiscent of that, which I'm not having like an opinion on that, because obviously Angular is a huge user base. There's people that love that approach. So it's just kind of like how you like to approach problems.
Yeah. And like I mentioned, it doesn't have to be, so MobX, it is, a lot of the examples I've seen have been class-based, but there's also a observable function, and you can make like whatever you want into a observable. So you can make like an observable array and pass that around. So you don't have to do the class thing. Someone in chat mentioned that MobX's strict mode requires that you only mutate things from inside actions, which I think that works fine with the object. At least I haven't seen warnings. If you do the observable pattern, you've got to like wrap your functions in action. There's another thing called action. You can like wrap your callbacks in action, and then MobX won't complain. But that's strict mode. Like it does work without that, so you can sort of pick how explicit you want to be, I guess. So this is our to-do list object, and then in app we're creating an instance of this thing. And notice it's like outside the component. So this is effectively a singleton. This file only gets imported, like instantiated once, and this thing will be long-lived, which is also weird from a React standpoint. Usually you want things to be in the component, so like they are immutable and React can control them and stuff. This you actually want the opposite. So like you make the one thing, and then you kind of, it's React is hands off, and MobX manages it.
Is MobX specific to React, or is it like a library that can be used like in other frameworks as well?
You can use it with other frameworks too. I know there's a MobX. So if I look in package JSON, there's a MobX, and there's a MobX React, and a MobX React Lite. So I think that there's like MobX other frameworks. I haven't tried it, but I assume it'll work.
Makes sense.
So, and then once you've got this thing, you can pass it around kind of however you want. You can pass it as a prop. You can use context. I think you could probably just export this and import it somewhere else. Whatever you want to do. And then once it's in this component, as long as it's wrapped in an observer, which you need to, this is what that library is for, wrap your components in this observer thing, and then MobX will just like watch for you. If you read one of these observables, then it knows you care about it, and if it ever changes, it will re-render that component. So it's all just kind of magic in the background. I think it's using proxies behind the scenes to like watch for reads and writes on objects and stuff. But then once you've got this, you can just call the methods on it and stuff, and it all just kind of works.
Yeah, it ends up being pretty clean.
Yeah, it is. It's definitely less code than a lot of the other options, but there's that trade-off. I think, like you mentioned, like some people really don't like the implicitness or like the hand wavy, like not knowing sure where variables are coming from, whatever. Yeah. So that's that. Still okay on time, I think. React query. So this is, like I mentioned, is not like a typical state management option. I think you'd use it for like general purpose state, but it's really useful for managing network requests and automatically keeping the data up to date and stuff. It's pretty nice. So let me pull up that example. And for this one, I need to start a server because it's failing. Or slow. Okay. Actually won't refresh this yet. So we've got one component here. Actually, okay. So there's a little bit of setup for React query. We've got to create a query client that lives outside the app and pass it into this provider thing, which, you know, we've seen providers with context now and stuff. It's the same pattern, makes it available to everything. Once you do this inside a component, you can call use query. Let me add this thing there. And use query takes these two arguments. The first is like a key. So we're going to call this thing to-dos. You can call it whatever you want. This is just so it React query can keep track of this thing in its own cache. And the second thing is a function that returns a promise. And I like this API a lot. I think it's the right abstraction around data fetching as far as I'm concerned, because you can use whatever fetching library you want. You can use fetch, you can use Axios, doesn't matter, as long as it returns a promise that eventually resolves the data. That data will get stored in the cache, and like it will manage the loading states for you and errors and refetching and everything. So you could see when we loaded this up the first time, oh, hey, it fixed itself. I don't know if you noticed, but when it was fetching, it does this, blanking on the term now, retry, exponential backoff thing, where it'll like try, and if it fails, it'll wait a little bit and then try again. Then it'll wait a little longer and try again. And it gives you a few tries before it gives up. And then the part where it automatically fixed itself, whenever I bring focus back to the browser, you can see this little flash of updating.
Yep.
So this is React query will automatically update data from the server. So like it already knows, you know, it knows your URL, it knows this, it's got this to-dos thing cached. But when you bring focus back, it's going to go back to the server and say, hey, has anything changed? Just give me the latest data. So if I go and actually change something, I've got this JSON server running in the background. If I go and change this to like books and false, save it. So it's not like watching this file or anything, but when I click back over here, you can see it updates and then it gets this new object.
Yeah, I think it's all like
awesome.
Configurable as well, right? So if you wanted to like not do it on focus, if you wanted to do it at a different time or whatever, you could make it work whatever made sense for your app, sort of thing.
Yeah, it is very configurable. There's a ton of options for it. It can also deal with other fancy, difficult things like pagination, and yeah, it's a pretty nice library. Definitely worth checking out.
Would you use React query with like other state management libraries? Like if you like, because it's like it's helping with the network, but then you also have like how you're going to store perhaps the data that comes from the network and how you're going to distribute that to your components and such.
Yeah, I think you'd probably want to use it with some other library too, or you know, with context and state and whatever. But yeah, I think it's because it's sort of specialized for network stuff. You probably end up wanting something else too, like store some global information or whatever. But it does seem like a lot of state management boils down to network requests and stuff. So
yeah,
like,
that's true.
handing that off to just React query. SWR is another similar library. Yeah, just like simplifies things a lot because I think once you get rid of the data fetching code, like there's not that much left, I think, in a lot of apps anyway.
Yeah, and it could be just that, but like stored in context or whatever, and just call it a day.
Yeah. Cool. So I think that's pretty much it for React Query and XState. Actually got to the last one. So XState is a state machine library, which is again very different from the other options here. It's not for like necessarily global state management or whatever, but it's specialized for building state machines. And state machines are really useful when you've got a process that's is asynchronous or based on timers or whatever, or you've got a lot of different variables to keep track of that all kind of depend on each other. State machines can make that a lot easier and make it so that you can never end up in invalid states, which is pretty awesome. There's a lot of good documentation out there for XState, and actually our own Ryan mentioned this the other day. And yeah, I feel like state machines, they kind of get a bad rap because they're hard to teach with. So to teach them, you kind of need to use simple examples. And then when you look at the simple examples, you go, well, that's just over-engineered. Like, why would you need a state machine for a traffic light? Or a modal dialogue or whatever. You don't need that. And I think that's kind of true. The problem is, like, if you throw like a large complex example, then that looks like way too much to take in at once. So there's sort of this funny paradox with just like popularizing them, I think. But once it's a different way of thinking for sure. But once you try it, I think it's a real nice feeling to know, like, oh, I've actually handled every possible case, and like it cannot be anything other than the states that I've specified. It's pretty nice.
Yeah, so, it's funny. That quote really resonates with me because I never think like maybe I just need to train my brain. But whenever I'm approaching a problem for the first time, state machines is never the first thought I have, right? It's always like, oh, this is simple, right? Like this is just a Boolean. That's all I need to worry about. And then it's like, oh, well, this is just a second Boolean, right? Like I have two use states with two Booleans. Like there's nothing that could go wrong here. But then, like, if you start with that approach, then that just compounds upon itself, and it can quickly turn into a mess.
Yeah, there's some great line there where you don't want to complicate things early by adding a state machine. But you don't want to complicate things later by adding another couple if statements.
Yeah. There's that painful, like, well, I should probably rewrite this now, but that's also going to be painful. Yeah. So I've got a really simple example with XState. Let me see if I can pull this out, or if it's actually going to let me do that. Can it work? Okay, yeah. I just built the traffic light example, or actually stole it from their homepage. So we've got like multiple states here, and each state is named. So we've got like green, yellow, red, and then within the state you've got this on object, which so when the timer action happens, then it will transition to yellow, and so on timer it will transition to red, and that's how it changes state. And then in the component you've got this use machine hook that will it'll re-render when the state changes, so we can like click next and it'll go through them. And it's got this is the state object, just like stringified down here, so you can see what it includes. There's a bunch of stuff here. And XState, again, like we don't have a ton of time today, but the rabbit hole goes a lot deeper than this. There's a lot to it if you want to look into XState. And there's another option called robot too. It's a little more functional. And I have a blog post that uses robot to build a confirmation model of all things. But yeah, it's kind of a pick whichever style you like, but I think it's useful to get some experience with state machines just to know that they exist, and that like they might be a good option for just to kind of have them in your back pocket if you need them.
Yeah, I'll also drop a link. We actually had David K. Piano, the guy behind XState, on React Wednesdays. Yeah, nice. It did an episode with us, so if you want to check that out, that was a good episode. I was actually amazed there. Like the dev tools that are built into that is also kind of crazy as well. Cool. Like it's nuts, some of the stuff he's working on. So definitely worth checking out.
You know, we had Tyler on the show, and he said, "I never drive through a traffic light without thinking of David K. Piano."
Awesome. I've got links to a bunch of stuff. I'm gonna drop the link to the main thing in the chat.
Oh, you're on top of it, man.
Is that where your code is as well? Because there was a request.
Yeah, the code is there, and there's a link to the slides, and then you can go from there to all the other links.
This is a great, very well organized demonstration that you put together. I appreciate it.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, and I'm going to give a big shout out for anybody that's watching this that hasn't read some of Dave's blogs. It's really high quality stuff, so you should check it out. And actually, Dave, like, you should give us like a link dump of like, where should people follow you? Like, oh, man.
Plug slide.
Oh, look at that!
Look what we made before.
I queued you up, man.
Yeah, thanks for that. Perfect layup. So yeah, check me out, daveceddia.com. I'm at dceddia on Twitter and pretty much everywhere else. Pure React is like my React book and video workshop, and there's some other courses, and this new Mac app if you do video stuff. But
that's a fantastic lineup of items right there.
Thanks.
And you have a newsletter, if I'm not mistaken.
I do, yeah. If you go to daveceddia.com/newsletter, I don't think that's actually linked anywhere. I'll just put it in the chat.
Is there a Dave Ceddia /Eversleeps?
There isn't, but I should make one of those.
Just asking for a friend.
I also love that you own the domain useeffectoverlunch.com. Like that's the kind of like esoteric like awesomeness I could get behind. That's really awesome.
Oh, and look, the MobX strip cross promotion shows up. JMZZCP says, I actually found out about this stream from the newsletter this morning.
Very cool.
Yeah, I sent out an email this morning.
Your marketing royalties will be in the mail soonish.
Very, very cool. Well, Dave, man, thanks. This was really awesome. So hopefully people check that out. We dropped some things in the links. It's really cool stuff, but we appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for coming, everyone.
It was a pleasure meeting you.
Really valuable.
Have a good one.
Yeah. See ya.